Our second panel session today will look at how our traditional understanding of our differences is being challenged, even as new differences arising from immigration, the reach of new media, and globalization emerge. How can Singapore cope with new complexities? Our chairperson for this panel is an illustrious diplomat and a special member of the IPS family, someone who has furthered Singapore's interests on the world stage and championed domestic causes crucial to nation building. He is Professor Tommy Koh, a former director of IPS and now a special advisor to the Institute. I will now hand over to Prof. Koh to introduce the panelists for this session. Prof. Koh.
I want to thank Lynn for her very sweet introduction. I think I should introduce her. Lynn Lee is the new Associate Director of the Institute of Policy Studies. She's taken the place of our good friend Zhang Li Lin, who, as you know, has become the Prime Minister's Press Secretary. Lynn studied at Brown University in the United States, spent about a decade in journalism, a few years in the private sector, before she was persuaded by Jana Das to join IPS. So let's give her a warm welcome to IPS. I want to make one comment on the inspiring remarks that Jana Das made this morning. He said the worst riot in Singapore's history was between the Hokkiens and the Teochew, and 400 people were killed. This, of course, happened over a century ago. But I want Jana Das to know that I made a modest contribution to good relations between the Hokkiens and Teochew. My second son, An, married a Teochew woman. Come back to panel 2. Panel 2 has a very interesting title, Living with New Differences. We know what the old differences are, race, language, religion, but I was not quite sure what Jana Das and Matthew had in mind when they asked me to chair this panel on the new differences. So I sent Matthew an email to ask him if he could please elucidate what new differences he would like panel 2 to focus on. He gave me a very vague response. So I'm going to try, if I can, Jana Das and Matthew, to share with all of you what I consider some of the new differences in Singapore. The difference between the rich and the poor, and in particular between the very rich, the 1%, and the rest of society, and between the super rich, the 0.1%, and the rest of society. Second, the difference between the local-born citizens and the foreign-born citizens and permanent representatives. Third, the differences between the citizens and the permanent residents and the 1.3 million foreign workers. Fourth, a growing difference between the senior citizens and the rest of society, and I here refer to a remark made recently by the Speaker of Parliament, Halimah Yacob, when she described Singapore as an ageist society. Fifth, the differences between our disabled compatriots and the rest of society. Sixth, the difference between the conservative heterosexual majority and the GLBT. Do you know what this means? When my wife first saw GLBT, she thought it sounded very much like BLT, which is a kind of sandwich in America. So I had to explain to her that GLBT means gay, lesbian, bisexual, transsexual. Transsexual or transgender? Transsexual, minority. And 7, there's a difference between the globalized cosmopolitan elite and the Singapore-centric heartlanders. And finally, I think there's a difference between those who are IT literate, like my good friend Arun, and those who are IT illiterate, like me. So these are some of the new differences. We have two very good speakers for this panel too, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Minister Sim N spent 13 years in the civil service. And during that period, she held positions in the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Home Affairs, Ministry of Trade and Industry, International Enterprise Singapore, and she was head of the National Population Secretariat. She entered politics in the year 2011, was elected as a member of the winning team in the Holland Bukit Timah GRC. She currently holds two portfolios, Minister of State in the Ministry of Education and Minister of State in the Ministry of Communications and Information. Please join me in welcoming Minister Sim N.
Very good morning to everyone gathered here. It is an honor to be invited to come and speak on differences, old or new, but I also must confess it is, to me, a somewhat daunting task. Made slightly more daunting by the fact that last night, as I was agonizing over what to talk about this morning, my husband waltzed into the room and said, "Hey, I'm going to this seminar tomorrow and you're speaking." And also made slightly more daunting by the fact that when I entered the ballroom, I discovered at least two of my former teachers sitting in the audience. I also realized when I had the pleasure of a preview of Professor David Chan's slides just before this session, that there's a reason why I was invited to speak on differences. Because looking at his meticulously prepared slides, I realized that I'm the preschool to his university. So you're going to see the difference later on. But first things first, I want to first wish those who are celebrating the Lunar New Year a very happy Year of the Horse in advance. After all, the season of Lo Hei is upon us, and this is how I'm going to start my talk. This year, I began the Chinese New Year Lo Hei season at the Sri Mariamman Temple, Mariamman Temple, of all places. I think that we have a photo of that. Okay. As many of us know, the Sri Mariamman Temple is the oldest and probably most famous Hindu temple in Singapore. It's located in the heart of Chinatown. And for the past 11 years, the temple's management and volunteers have been organizing Chinese New Year Lo Hei for the less fortunate members of society, including residents from old folks' homes. To mark the occasion and to share the festive joy, the temple also invites representatives from its partner organizations like Chinatown Enterprises and the mosque next door. So the meal is prepared by the temple's own kitchen and served by its volunteers. It features vegetarian raw fish salad, or yu sheng, and the starters are a mix of spring rolls and pakoras. Absolutely delicious, I highly recommend it. And halfway through the meal, the temple chairman and I went around distributing ang paos. I feel very privileged to have been invited to such a special occasion. And during and after the meal, I reflected to myself that there are not that many places in the world where one can experience a meal like this. Examples like this, I think, reflect a commitment to racial and religious harmony that has taken us many years to build. And it also reflects the persistent effort of many community leaders who feel that it is important to keep reaching out to each other. Race in terms and religious harmony, I think we have managed to make a very big thing happen in a small place. There is a book by the Japanese author Haruki Murakami, which I'm quite fond of, and I find myself flipping through it every now and then. The title is South of the Border, West of the Sun. There's a passage in it, in the voice of the main protagonist. His name was Hajime, And this passage sticks out in my mind. It goes something like this. The town I grew up in was your typical middle-class suburbia. The classmates I was friendly with all lived in neat little row houses. Some might have been a bit larger than mine, but you could count on them, all having similar entranceways, pine trees in the garden, the works. My friends' fathers were employed in companies or else were professionals of some sort. Hardly anyone's mother worked, and most everyone had a cat or a dog. No one I knew lived in an apartment or a condo. Later on, I moved to another part of town, but it was pretty much identical. The upshot of this is that until I moved to Tokyo to go to college, I was convinced everyone in the whole world lived in a single-family home with a garden and a pet and commuted to work decked out in a suit. I couldn't for the life of me imagine a different lifestyle. It sticks out in my mind because this is, I think, more or less the complete opposite of my experience growing up in Singapore, and probably those of many who also grew up in Singapore. We live in a society in which there are many, many differentiators, and which I think if you put all of our childhood experiences together, you would have a veritable kaleidoscope. So the topic of this panel is living with new differences. That implies that there is a distinction between old differences, which I take to be race, language, and religion, and new differences, which, as the conference brief has helpfully suggested, are born of trends like immigration, new media, and globalization. I have 3 thoughts to share on this. The first thought is really a question, and the question is it useful to think of differences as being old and new? Now, to some extent, I can see how certain differences beyond race, language, and religion might strike us as being new. It is true that demographic changes, including those brought about by immigration, has introduced differences and has also affected the way we think about them. Some of these differences can be quite visible. I've written about this before, so I don't plan to enlarge upon it at this platform, but obviously if this is a question or if this is a topic of great interest, we can always discuss it later on during the interaction time. On the other hand, there's also technology, which has separated the world into digital natives and non-natives. It powerfully enables us to come into contact with people who are very different from ourselves, and yet it also gives us an unprecedented ability to control and edit our own social circles. So for instance, on Facebook, I think all of us who have Facebook accounts are far more likely to be friends with people who share some basic characteristics and outlook with us. And it's all too easy to unfriend individuals if you find their views unpalatable. And if you look at the update feeds from the list of friends that you have personally curated, sometimes it can really feel like an echo chamber. And views that are very similar to yours get amplified, and it's very easy to then feel that most everyone thinks or reacts the same way as you do to certain issues. But at the same time, I think it is less obvious that other kinds of differences are necessarily new. For instance, the difference that we experience between various age groups. Or indeed, when it comes to special needs, which is a topic that's very close to my heart. These are differences that we may find ourselves talking about more often these days. These are also differences that may be receiving more public attention, as they well should. But I don't think it necessarily makes sense to characterize such differences as new. I think diversity is all around us, and it will continue to be the case. Even as some differences become less salient or even fade over time, others will emerge. I think what matters is the philosophy underlying how we live with all kinds of differences in our midst. And my personal take on this is that diversity, well managed, is Singapore's strength. What doesn't pull us apart will make us stronger. The second thought I have on this topic is that the basis for living well with diversity is the ability to appreciate differences. I was reminded when preparing for this panel that the writer Graham Greene once wrote that hate was just a failure of imagination. We often talk about empathy as an essential ingredient for being able to appreciate and understand others. But what exactly is empathy? It helps, of course, if, as individuals, we have had personal experiences that allow us to relate to others or which can apply to different kinds of situations. We're then able to say, I know what it's like. I know what it's like to have grown up in a certain way. I know what it's like to have been treated in a certain way. But how about the many other times when we can't say, I know what it's like? How do we then instill and strengthen empathy short of living another person's life? My personal view on this is that reading and the study of literature are of great help here. I notice my friend Janice in the audience. I hope this is something she agrees with. This is where I need to make a personal disclosure and a health warning. Literature was my absolute favorite subject in school. So if it was not, thank you. If it was not your absolute favorite subject, you might want to, fiddle on your mobile phone for the next sort of 10 minutes or so. Just kidding. I think, however, that literature is more than a study in the beauty of thoughts expressed in words. It is a discipline for looking at the world with someone else's eyes, to seek to understand why a person might feel or do or say something, however unlikely it might be for us to feel or do or say those things. By requiring students to hunt for and interpret textual clues, literature builds sensitivity to nuances and a habit of observation before judgment. It requires, and it in turn enriches, the reader's understanding of history, psychology, and many other fields. So I support MOE's efforts in making literature as widely available to students as possible in schools, and also the National Library Board's efforts to promote reading among the public at large. So for those of you who are not particularly keen on literature, we'll now return to the topic at hand. I'm going to talk about the third thought that I have, and it has to do with preserving the common space. I don't think there's anyone in this room who doubts the importance of preserving shared experience and the common space in a diverse society like Singapore. How else, after all, to hold us all together? My thought in particular is that the preservation of the common space is an untidy business that is characterized more by goodwill and give and take than by the application of abstract rules of logic and consistency. If we get the empathy part right, and that relates to my second point about reading and literature, then it's not very hard to see why this is the case. Every life, every experience lived by individuals of different affiliations, identities, and characteristics is unique. To fully understand the perspective of someone different than you is to accept and embrace that uniqueness, to appreciate the accommodation that each group requires from society is also to recognize how important and singular it is to that group. It is difficult, I think, if not impossible, to weigh one unique request against another. But if we agree that it is more important for us as a society to be together rather than apart, then I think it is possible to settle on agak-agak compromises, and we can also let them evolve over time. I was asked a question at a dialogue yesterday about the government's role in preserving the common space. Is there really pushback from other groups when any one particular group in society asks for special accommodation? Now, this is a question that set me thinking for a while. The term pushback of a thronging crowd, pushing and shoving against each other into a shrinking space, with government in the middle trying to persuade everyone to please stand back. I don't think that this image is one that many groups and societies have of themselves. Just ask around, I don't think any group, whatever their affiliation or identities, will agree that they are pushing or shoving against anyone else. So that's not the image I have either when it comes of preserving the common space. I have rather a different picture in my mind. Imagine, if you will, a village that's formed by a ring of houses of all shapes and sizes, and they're backing onto a village square. The square is not very regular to begin with. The backs of some houses jut out more into the square than others. But the square is a place that villagers enjoy using for gatherings, for walks, for picnics. One day, a family starts to build an extension to the back of its house and claims a little bit of the square. It's a very reasonable thing to do. The family is expanding, they need a bit more room, and in any case, some houses already jut out into the square more than others, and it was never regular to begin with. It is a small change that hurts none of its immediate neighbors. So to the family, it's not just a reasonable thing to do, it's a necessary thing to do. No one can find any basis to object. In fact, it would be quite churlish for anyone to do so. Another family finds that they too need a small extension onto the square and builds it. A third family voices its support for the first two and quickly adds its own extension. And this carries on for a while, and then the village decides to regularize the practice for fairness. And after vigorous and exhausting debate, the village comes up with a complex set of rules on how much of the square each family is entitled to. And then eventually there is no square left. I think a few things are true about this picture. Every family who wishes to make an extension has an eminently reasonable request. Applying a set of abstract rules too is a very logical thing to do. But it is also true that at the end of the day, the village lost something. So this is the mental picture I have of the challenges of preserving the common space. Losing the village square either bit by bit or even altogether is not necessarily the end of the world, but I think it does mean changing what the village looks like and the experience of living in it. And if we are that village, we have to decide whether this is the approach we want. And this is something that I am fully aware many of you in the audience may or may not agree with, but I think for what it's worth, we would have collectively participated in a small exercise of empathy, I hope. At least empathy with the people whose job it is to think about the village square. So in conclusion, allow me to just recap 3 key points. First, I think diversity is all around us, and whether it is living with old or new differences, we need a shared understanding that what doesn't pull us apart will make us stronger. Also, it is important to enable the appreciation of differences, and literature helps. Last but not least, we need to preserve the common space. It's not a neat approach of rules and logic necessarily, perhaps more an untidy business of give and take, but I think it's our best bet going forward. Thank you.
I thank Minister Sim for her contribution. I'm particularly cheered by her passion for reading and literature. And since she's the Minister of State in the Ministry of Education, I'm sure you all join me in appealing to her to do whatever she can to promote reading as a lifelong habit of all Singaporeans and the reading of literature in all our schools, especially books written by our own authors. Yeah. Our second speaker is a very good friend, Professor David Chan. Professor Chan is the Professor of Psychology and founding director of the Institute of Behavioral Sciences at SMU. He's regarded by his peers in his particular area as one of the thought leaders in his particular area of specialization, which is, I think, industrial and organization psychology. David, please.
Hello, distinguished guests. It's an honor to speak before you, and it was easy for me to say yes when IPS invited me to do this thing, because the topic was new emergent group differences. And after looking at the first panel, which says like CMIO, and then the second one says anything other than that, which means that my talk can never be irrelevant, and I can speak about any group differences, be it new or old. Second, if you have seen in my abstract in the booklet, I did put new in inverted commas, and so there will be no contradiction with what Siman said, that are they really new or not new? With the inverted commas, like all academics, you will never go wrong. Right? Literature is my weakest subject, but I agree that we should let everybody study literature, you know. That's completely irrelevant. Yeah. All right, what I want to do to share with you in the next 20 minutes or so, and I'm going to go quite fast, and I speak very fast. I need to apologize. It's habits of the heart that is difficult to change. But don't worry too much about the cluttered and non-meticulously prepared slides. We will have the time to go into more details later. Okay, and it might be good for those of you who really are not the visual slides part, maybe just to focus on some of the main points and we can talk about. What I want to do is to lay some maybe context as we get a little bit away, not so much away, but maybe beyond the CMIO, to talk about some emergent group differences. You'll see a couple of slides, just some ideas that I've shared in various situations, be it in newspaper, be it in closed-door conferences, sessions with public servants or politicians, or open sessions, and I tried to put them together of what I really feel in the past few years. And some of these I felt pretty strongly well before the national conversation and well before the population white paper. So I would like to kind of reiterate some of this and speak about the notion of a strategic focus to approaching some of these issues as opposed to what may appear to be a piecemeal kind of a strategy. And then I will conclude the second half with talking about some of the approaches that I think we need to, or we could consider looking at emergent group differences. And I'm sure there will be lots of debate, and my job is not to persuade you, but to give you some food for thought before lunch. The emergent group differences, maybe we should get some agreement in the beginning. I'm going to speak about it in the RPP context. In other words, whether you are a researcher, you are a politician or a policy maker, or you're just talking about it in practice as an NGO or somebody in the day-to-day living. So I'm not separating this and say, let's talk about it in terms of research or policy or practice in particular. And I think we can all agree that it would be good to start by saying what kind of society we want to be as a country. And these are the list of which I'm sure many people have said as well. These are the societal end goals that I wrote in the Straits Times article, I think just before the population white paper, or actually a few months before the population white paper came out. And I hope we agree that ultimately we want citizen well-being and quality of life as central. There must be opportunities for all Singaporeans. We want it to be compassionate, inclusive, but whatever that means is quite a separate question. And we want people to be rooted and committed to Singapore, not only citizens, but PRs, and to some extent, I think foreigners as well. And can we be an adaptive and resilient society? Because things are going to happen, and when things happen, how do we bounce back? How do we adapt? Now, if we agree on this as societal end goals, I think it makes the job a little bit easier, a little bit. We may still not come to consensus on things we discuss, but at least we got a framework. And so let's go straight to the focus issues. Now, these are the traditional terms and concepts when we talk about group differences for many, many years, right? Maybe up to about 3 to 5 years ago. We talk about the CMIO classification. We classified religions according to the major types. You look at any social surveys, those are the classic groupings that in the demographic section that you must have. And we also use terms like race and religious group relations. I've done work for ministries for close to 20 years now, maybe. Most national surveys, we will always ask about race and religious group relations, and those are the exact words that we use. And politicians talk about sectoral interests versus national interests, about how an ethnic group or otherwise pushes your interests and how you push back. And we seem to suggest that sectoral and national interests are actually diametrically opposed. And so what we do, through national education, and we talk about multiculturalism, we emphasize on social harmony, the notion of cohesion, and gradually we talk about national values in the sense of national identity. Now, these are the concepts that you and I grew up with, but in the last 5 years, I think the language has changed somewhat, or at least beyond the slide you just saw. We talk about changing demographics and what are the emergent group differences, which Tommy, Janadas, and others have quite well articulated that perhaps these are the 4 or 5 things that is very salient in our mind, in public discourse, and in policy discussions. And we use terms like social identities, social divides, and intergroup relations. Interestingly, these are terms which sociologists and psychologists and behavioral scientists have been using, studying for the past 100 years or so. And so there is a very relevant science that one can take note of. Right? We talk about Singaporean core, Singapore integration, social integration, social capital, and social and national resilience. Right? I won't go into this. Many of you are familiar. Now, why do I bring that up? And let me just illustrate with you, for you 2 or 3 issues, and to suggest to us that the issues are really much more complex than just including another age variable or gender variable into your social survey, and maybe just do a cross step and say, okay, you know, what are we going to do for policy? It's really much more complicated than that. Now, we have rising singlehood, we have low TFR, the population is aging. It has been aging all along, but the aging issues become more salient now, and of course we have immigration issues. Your family forms, MSF, all my good friends at MSF, I'm sorry to say this, but your family forms, you never need to go beyond the traditional family. Because if you say that the traditional family is the 2 parents with the children all living under one roof, I'm not sure if that's actually the majority, and or that's the only group that you should care about. So if you want family to be the building block of society, one will have to really appreciate the diversity of family forms. And these are actually what I call group differences, new group differences, even within a variable called family. There's DINK, right, the double income, no kids, and I coined a term yesterday called the DIM, which is double income with 1 maid, and then there's, and then you have single parent, multi-generational, transnational marriages. These are issues which I think we haven't given enough consideration, not to mention, I think, detailed research and so on. I'm not going to go through all the slides, right, because of time. So I'm going to skip quite a few bullet points. Think about age. Now, if we think about age, I know I don't have time. I just want to say this. What we are dealing and talking about an ageist society is quite anti-science. In other words, a lot of things that we do and say about intergeneration differences actually go against the science of sociology and psychology. Old people or elderly people or not so young people actually have very important skills and knowledges, right? Because there are different types of intelligences, they have different linkages in their minds and brains, and these are some of the things that we tend to ignore. What is true is that the speed of processing goes down as you age, but there are other kinds of knowledges that actually goes up as you age, and I think we forgot those things. So if we could redesign jobs for cleaners, why can't we redesign jobs and think about the jobs that can fit an aging society in a way that we do not be so hung up over the age dependency ratio, right? And when you look at that, then your elderly becomes a real resource and asset, not because you have to, not because it's politically correct to, because it's scientifically accurate to do so. And I think we need to look at that from that perspective, so that your social expenditure and budget is coming up. When you debate your COS, go ahead and give more money to MSF and other people, because that is not just expenditure, and it's not just expenditure and it's gone. They are actually investment into your capital, your social and human capital of your society, and that can become a force multiplier to solve a lot of problems that I think we are facing. Time is really running out, so I'm just going to share with you that on this slide, there are plenty of social divides that we can talk about, and maybe we can talk about them during the panel discussion. I just want to conclude this first part to say that the reason for showing you all these complex group differences, and there are many more, is that we probably need to discuss an issue and locate it in a specific intergroup relation setting. Now, if we don't do that, and when we talk about groups in the abstract, I think we may not go anywhere, right? If you do not say what is the intergroup setting we are talking about, is it in the aging policy, resource issue, a health issue, and so on. And to understand that the ongoing issue is always embedded in the ongoing social political context, and so we cannot remove the politics from it. And when we link it to nation building, not in the national propaganda sense, but just in the first slide that I show you, that if these are the goals that you want to achieve as a society, then we can have a common framework to have a discuss, to have a constructive debate, and so on. And that brings me to the second part, and I'm right in the middle of the time, so I hope I'm okay, to talk about what I think we could do strategically to approach the issue of emergent group differences. This is my own view, and I would like to share with you that whether you're talking about research, policy, or public, or just in practice, perhaps our approach needs to consider some of these mindsets. I don't think we think enough in terms of strategic futures. And this is not to belittle the government at all. We are doing quite well in strategic futures when it comes to water, right? We worry about what happened to our water. We have the taps, and we think really way ahead, and we make all our plans well ahead. We even have scenario plans, scenario plus, and so on. But when it comes to our social futures, many of my good friends in the civil service, highly intelligent, very good, but could not define a social future. And that's not their fault, because we have never used those words and those discourse. But I think that is what we need, to start thinking about various alternative social futures, and are we building a society that could deal with these alternate social futures? So we need to start thinking in terms of strategic terms, in terms of social futures, when we talk about group differences. And I think up to now, I haven't heard anybody say about group differences in the sense of not group membership, but group identities. Actually, the truth, the science tells us that we have multiple group identities. Actually, I'm not just male, I'm also Singaporean, Chinese, I'm also a professor, I also live in Chinatown, I also take public transport every day. And that's me. At any one time, my different social identities can be activated. When I am speaking to a group full of females, my male identity gets activated automatically, right? In a neutral sense, okay? But when I am in a public transport, when I'm squeezed, right, during peak hours, and sometimes I do get squeezed in the peak hours, the only good thing about being a professor is you don't have to go to work on time, so you can avoid the MRT. But when I get stuck in the MRT, my identity gets activated is a public transport commuter. And that explains some of my Straits Times articles where you see some little hidden angst in there, and that is because we need to solve the infrastructure problem, right? I am probably not on the lower decile of your social income, but I am not happy with the public transport situation. So do not think that public transport is the lower deciles and so on, right? You think about the social identities that get activated in people's routine functioning, and I think that is what that matters. And therefore, to Prof. Chan Heng Chee's question, which is an excellent one, when we think about the multiple social identities in that sense, I think the coexistence is one, not just that, oh, can I have these 5 identities together? It's about, is it possible that we function constructively in our routine functioning where our different identities get activated? And when our identities get activated and we start clashing, is it possible to have interventions or policies whereby we either avoid those identity clashes by activating other identities? Right? That's another way of thinking about coexistence in a very dynamic way. Okay? And I would want to use my remaining 7 minutes or so to say that the strategic approach perhaps should think about the building block in a different way from family as a building block. I know this is controversial. I still agree that family should be the building block. I just want to have the caveat that there are different family forms. There's a whole group of singles that you need to take care of because they are not going to get married. They will get older, and you want to use those as people as resource. The question about family as the building block is quite dangerous for this group because that means they say, whatever I do, I'm not your building block. Okay, so it is important to think about the building blocks, perhaps in addition to family. Can we have another narrative of a building block? And I suggest that the notion of building block should be home. In other words, if we start in our policies and research examining the idea of home in a community, the meaning of home can actually apply not only to Singaporeans but to PR. This is my second home. It can apply even to foreigners. This is the place that I'm going to spend 10 years, 20 years working, and I'm going to have my home here for the next 10 to 15 years. When we start thinking about home in community, and it then evokes a sense of emotional attachment and rootedness to Singapore, not necessarily in a traditional sense of just citizenship and so on, right? And of course, they'll be qualitatively different. The commitment of citizens is still different from foreigners, but at least now we can talk about issues of rootedness and foreigners, commitment even among foreigners. I would also suggest that we approach emergent group differences by building social psychological resources to achieve goals. I think the biggest problem, and I've said this subtly in some articles that I wrote publicly, I think the problems with Singapore and with a lot of well-educated people, we think that emotions are bad and rationality is good, and so it's dichotomous. When you have one up, the other one must go down. That is, again, totally against the science of emotions, right? Emotions happen, and negative ones happen because our goals get frustrated. When I have a particular goal, and it's not getting there, and you frustrate my goals, I have negative emotions. And so rationality is just optimal striving to get to my goal. And I'm doing things to try to get to my goal. Now, my goal may be a bad goal. It could be a goal that is even destructive. But once you understand that rationality is striving towards goals, and emotions occur, negative ones, when your goal striving is obstructed, it makes perfect sense when we talk about public expectations, about social media, and so on. In other words, as policymakers and researchers, we then have to identify the goals, motivations of the people in order to understand the goal-striving process. Then your emotions will not be treated as a bad thing, and you will not trivialize it. Right? I think that's something that we need to look at as we talk about group differences, because they are highly emotive. I think more attention will need to be given to values and principles. I, again, may say something that sounds controversial, but probably it's not that controversial when you think about it. I don't like to use the word meritocracy at all, because it means different things for different people. In fact, historically, if you see how the term that emerged, it is not really that nice a term, the situation under which the terms emerge. I use words like core values and shared values like integrity, fairness, and social harmony. Because these are the kinds of values that it is quite easy to get consensus, and these are the values that is almost impossible to disagree. And once you decompose these values into its forms, then issues of compassionate meritocracy or performance-based meritocracy can make sense. For example, if you think about fairness, you can talk about fairness in the outcome, fairness in the process, fairness in performance standards, and fairness in opportunity to perform. If you understand fairness as at least 4 dimensions, then it is not contradictory against fairness to have compassionate meritocracy in certain sense, in certain situations, or talk about social mobility in others, right? Without trivializing the fact that reward should be performance-based at the same time. And then these values, because they are abstract, in order to deal with group differences, you have to still translate them into actual policy action and public actions, right? For example, if you want to do a collective action, you need to have some agreement on how to translate some of these values. Let's suppose you have a day where the government is not so-called doing the right thing, and you are going to speak in a collective way. Can we have some agreement on the principles to do that, right? And if you believe in the rule of law, then it becomes much easier. Right? If you believe that people should be accountable, not only politicians, but as individuals, whatever we say in social media, we can stand up and be accountable for what we say. And then, as an NGO, you can be accountable for the things you say and you do. And then everybody can have a common principles to translate these values into action. And then when you look at group differences, I think it means a whole lot of different things. I have 2 more slides, and I have 2 minutes. Which is impossible. So I am going to now then end off with speaking to you about the conventional differences, because there are some researchers among you, and there are also many public servants here that look at research findings every day. I think we need to take a more evidence-based approach. When we look at our multiple social identities, we need to start looking at interaction effects. You can easily constitute a table, compose a table where Chinese, Malay, Indians, and then you nest it religion, where you put religion under that, and you'll find that there is Indian Muslims, and then there's Malay Muslims, and you'll find that you get a different set of results. Okay, and so depending on how you put your table, you realize that actually there could be everybody is agreeing, everybody is disagreeing, and then you collapse across to CMIO, you actually get 2 identical tables. Okay, this can easily be done in any simulation, and it's actually happening in real data. So really be very careful when we look at each demographic variable by itself, instead of how it interacts or cross-step with other variables. Second point may sound highly academic, but I think it's very important. I think for 20 years, we have based our policy and discourse on means. In other words, we compare 2 groups, male, female, Chinese, Malay, and look at the means, right, the average. But when you decompose it, it is the variance that is very important that may be explaining what is going on. So if I have a group of 5 people and another group of 5 people, right, on a scale of 1 to 5, do you like this talk? These 5 people may say 3, so the average is 3. Do you like this talk? These 5 people may say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? I have complete disagreement in the second group. The average is still 3. So you get 2 groups and you think that the mean is the same. There are completely different things going on. I can have another group where half the people say it's 1, the other half say it's 5. So there's complete polarization of attitudes. The average is still 3. Right? So when we start looking at the within group variances, which we haven't been looking at, I think it gives a whole new meaning to the idea of group differences. And when you look at those terms, the dynamic of multiple identities, the within-group variances and not just the means, and the fact that different identities can be activated, then I think it forces us to think in terms of profiles. It forces us to say that over time, an individual like David Chan actually has a series of identities, and depending on the context, different identities get activated. And over time, what is changing? Are there things and signals in society that are changing, that are going to be antithetical to our societal end goals? Or are there things that are not changing, and they are great and that we need to reinforce? Right, and I think with that, let me just end off with this slide and steal 1 minute from you. That the practical implication of all this is, I do think that while there may not be new group differences, there are new, inverted commas, group differences that call for a new way that goes well beyond our conventional approach, right, in research, practice, and in policy. And I think if we continue, not continue, but if we choose to ignore or trivialize group-based types of emotions and cognitions, it's politically self-defeating, scientifically inaccurate, and it may lead to destructive or policy and public action. Right? So we do need to understand social psychological processes better and then apply the knowledge appropriately. Thank you very much.
I thank David for a very learned presentation. I think the two major points he's made is that we need a strategic approach to looking at these new differences in emerging group differences. And his second point is that we need something beyond the conventional approach, but we should adopt an evidence-based approach. I think those are the two major takeaways I've taken from this learned lecture. Now it's for you to ask Minister Sim and Prof. Chan good questions. Who would like to begin? Zaino, please. Zaino, and then you. Okay. Okay. So let's start with Zaino Abidin.
Thank you.
Then you.
Thank you, Prof. I have two brief questions, Prof. But before that, if with your indulgence, I'd like to make a comment first. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Janadis and IPS for a very well thought out conference, even to the point of giving us pens with 4 colors. Halal food.
But that's not CIMO. You know?
Halal food, prayer hall, and everything, except that maybe I thought maybe a Malay member of the panel would actually complete the picture. Nevertheless, we have a Siddiqui, so it's nothing like sharing Sharon as part of the total multiracial team. And also your sentiment about Hokkien and Teochew, I was a bit surprised to hear that because in 1964, I was almost killed in the racial riots. I thought I could have been the 37 figure, but I survived. And I then knew the meaning of the importance of multiracialism. Like you, I also like to feel that I have contributed towards the Hokkien Teochew harmony. My children haven't married Teochew Hokkien yet, but I can sing IPI Chia. I grew up in a Hokkien environment, but served in the Teochew constituency. So I don't know Teochew song, but they still call me Kakinang, so that's all right. Now, the two questions I have, in fact, I share the sentiments by David and also Professor Heng Chi's concerns just now, and they are about religion, and two, our relationship with our neighbors. And this is to do also with differences. Now, on religion, I think that the complicating part of our multiracialism in Singapore, the new differences notwithstanding, will be the Malays. A very significant majority, very intriguing. Some say even I lost the last election because of hard truth about the Malays. But this is where the problem is, I think. Do we really understand the Malays and their religion? Sometime back, I was told by a Chinese colleague See, the problem with you all, I mean, you are Malays, you are very good, very kind, very tolerant, very easy. But what we don't like is that you are Muslims. Because that comes with extremism, extreme way of life, food problem, cannot shake hand, and now the tudong issue. So my question is actually, how do we approach this question about Malays and Muslims in Singapore context, in the context of the strategic futures mentioned by David just now? But beyond the Malay and Muslims, do we really understand the other side of religion? For example, the changing profile of Chinese and their religion, the emergent Christians. You heard, you remember in Cheng San election, where religion, Chinese, majority Chinese men among the Chinese, and the sedan chair carried by Chinese for the minority Christian Chinese. I think those are the features. Do we really understand that in terms of what it means for the future? And number two, question of our relations with our neighbors, Malaysia and Indonesia in particular. I think you know Malaysia is having problems of their own in terms of race relations. How will it impact on us? We are a minority, Malays, Muslim minority in Singapore, but majority in the context of our immediate neighborhood of South Asia. But again, the Chinese, the majority in Singapore, but in the context of minority in South Asia, but again, a big majority when you bring China into the picture. So there are these overlapping concerns and interests, and how do we prepare ourselves for the challenges of the strategic futures? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. As there are many hands in the room, maybe we can take two persons at a time, then I'll ask the Minister and Prof. Chan to respond. You have the floor.
Thank you, Prof. Koh. Janice Koh. I just want to, I have a question for MOS Siman. First of all, thank you very much for your speech and for your strong support of literature, which I've spoken up a lot on, and also for touching on these two terms, common space and pushback. These are terms which, as an artist and an actor in the theatre and film scene for over 20 years, I'm very familiar with, especially now as an NMP, representing the arts in Parliament. The term pushback is often thrown at me and artists working in the arts whenever we might do a play, make a film that possibly touches on controversial, potentially sensitive topics, whether it's race, religion, LGBT issues, and more often now about citizenship and immigration. The regulators would say there will be pushback from conservative sectors. We don't want pushback from government. But the arts, literature, theatre, film are the very platforms which create a safe space for us to discuss these issues, to dialogue, to debate, and for a chance for everyone watching it or reading it to see the world through a different lens and therefore come to a different understanding of someone else's point of view. What are the dangers then of government becoming too much of a gatekeeper and over-regulating this space? What happens, I feel, is that the common space is no longer a space that we share despite our differences, moderating our views organically to take into consideration other people's sensitivities. What it is fast becoming is an empty space, a gated space which everybody tries to avoid or tiptoe around in fear of possible clashes and argument. So I suppose my question is, what does common space mean now? And how do we create a safe space for the dialogue and debate to happen based on goodwill, despite the disagreements, so that, referencing Professor Kwok earlier, so that we can come to an understanding and still move on despite our differences, rather than avoid talking about it altogether? Thank you.
I thank Janice for a very, very good question. So we have three questions. I think Zaino, just recap. Zaino asked three questions. One, do we, the non-Malays, truly understand the Malays and their religion? Secondly, how do we deal with the rise of religiosity in Singapore, not just among the Muslim community, but also in the Christian community, Buddhist community, Hindu community, and so on. And Zaino's third question is, how will developments in our neighboring countries, for example, Malaysia, impact our nation-building process in Singapore? Janice asked really a good question about the common space, the role of the arts, and so on. So who wants to go first? And you want to go first? Yeah.
Allow me to have a brief response to Mr. Zainuddin's point, and then also say something about common space and the arts, how I see it. David might want to also jump in. Okay. I think with regards to race and religion, in particular, the point about the Malay community that Mr. Zainuddin has raised, I think it underscores the reality that race and religion remain very important. They're very important descriptors. They are very important parts of what makes up individuals' identities in Singapore and in elsewhere. Can we ever truly understand any particular group if we are not of that group? It's hard, but I think we must try. That, I think, is the motivation I feel that we need to continue to have as a society. In terms of how to do that, I think there are many mechanisms in place, but many may need to be strengthened, or we may need to introduce more. And this is something that I think we should always be open to new ideas on. But my own view is, it's hard, but we must try to understand each other. And it's something that I think is easy to forget from time to time. If you look at, for instance, the Chinese community, sometimes I am also myself struck by how much lack of knowledge there may be between different segments of the Chinese community. Myself often surprised and dismayed by very sweeping statements that I hear from one member of the Chinese community about another. And that is within the context of the so-called old difference. They may belong to the same sort of overall group. Again, like I said, I think it's hard to fully understand where all of us are coming from, but we must try. On literature, arts, and a safe space, I would say this, that I agree and I support the view of Janice, and I think many in the arts community, that the arts should be a safe space where many issues can be discussed and aired. I think the trouble is that not everyone agrees that it's necessarily a safe space. In fact, is a billboard on Orchard Road a safe space to express certain types of marketing ideas? Judging by some of the emails that I have received, some people also don't think that's a safe space. This is also where I think what any regulator would do well to be very, very cautious about is that precisely because of what I mentioned, I don't think there is pushback in the sense of people pushing and shoving against each other. But is there reaction? Yes. I think very often the regulator ends up experiencing the push more than anyone else. Maybe that's where the term comes from. I'm not sure. But I think when I answer a question, a very important question like the one that Janice raises, I'm also very cautious not to then talk about examples where such reactions have occurred, because then I become the one saying, here be cleavages. And I'm not either representing an agency or regulator, whether I want to be the one saying that here be cleavages. After all, we are all trying to forge some sense of a common destiny. So that's the difficulty that I think we find ourselves in. So I am not entirely sure that we have a very broad consensus that the arts are and should be a safe space. But I believe it should be. And I think if the government didn't believe it should be, we wouldn't actually have a lot of the mechanisms and support that we currently have for the arts. And I think this is something that we should continue to work on. Certainly, in terms of are we in danger of over-regulating, I certainly hope not. No government in its right mind would want to over-regulate this particular sector. The sentiments and the emotions, the views are, I think, so fraught and so potentially sometimes highly charged that I think it takes a lot of serious thought and again, I think a lot of application of empathy in order to be able to create, as you say, that particular safe space. But work with us. I know the arts community have been doing so, and I also want to take this opportunity to thank Janice for all her good work in raising a lot of these important issues, not only in platforms like this, but also in Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. The question, can you hear me? Yeah. I think the questions on fully understand, I think it's impossible. You will never fully understand. If you are not a Malay, you will never fully understand a Malay. If you do not believe me, ask any married couple, do you understand? You ask the husband, do you fully understand your wife? And you ask the wife, do you fully understand the husband? And you live with them every day. You could be in a wonderful, loving relationship. When you are not a female, as a male, you will never fully understand the female and vice versa. And we see male and female every day. We interact with them. We have wonderful relationships. You can think about good best friends. They are male and female. So perfection is not the standard. The issue is that with the current status, are we having a lot of problems? And what is the incremental gain in terms of integration purpose that we need to achieve in order to deal with that, right? So I like to think about the same way that we think about MRT trains. We are not trying to say that I must be able to pick my seat in MRT train, that's perfection. I'm saying that can I get to my work on time, okay? So compared to what I used to, that I can get to work on time. So once we understand that it is an impossible goal, then I think it is better, it's easier to do. And I would suggest that the only way you can do this is to try to appeal to some of the core values, such as respect for individuals, respect for differences, and try to activate some other social identities other than race and religion when it is an impossible situations to solve. Very quickly, I was in the police force for 9 years before I became an academic. My best friend is a Malay. We are still best friends. Every time during Hari Raya, I will SMS him, and during Christmas and New Year, he will SMS me. We have a wonderful relationship, but I don't pretend that I know and understand Malay or Muslims, even though in my 9 years of police, I interact so much with Malay officers. So I think the caveat there is that what you're trying to aim for is not perfection, but the current situation, and relate that to values. Religiosity, I can't comment on the Islamic part of it because I'm no authority at all. But I do want to say that I think there is emerging differences that we need to watch out for. And I request, because I can do that, I request media do not report what I'm about to say in the next 3 minutes. And I meant it, I do not report what I say in the 3 minutes.
Please,
you cannot,
please respect David's request.
Right. Because we want to have an honest discussion. You cannot assume that the Catholic new citizens and the Catholic immigrants here are the same Catholics that the Singapore Catholics are. Neither can you assume that for any other religion. I just use Catholic as an example. Now that has tremendous implication. It means that you could end up, if you're not careful with your demographics, where you have people and you thought, oh, you are all the same religion, but actually they have differences in terms of who is my religious authority. So your interracial circles and all these things, when the crisis happen, you cannot assume that all the people, because they are in the same religion, they look to the same authority. Okay, I think that's a very important thing, and I hope our authorities are looking at that. And instead of getting too hung up over the race, which is physically you can see, the religious part that you can't see actually could be equally important. The second part I want to make about religiosity, and I'm not referring to any particular case, because if I do, it will be sub judice when things are before the courts. I think it is important to be careful when religiosity get out of hand, where you think a line has been crossed that religiosities can override fundamental, not necessarily rationality, but beliefs about what is right and wrong, the rule of law and all. And I think that part we need to monitor. The final part on pushback, although it's not directed at me, Janice's question, I only have 2 comments. One is, whenever there is sectoral, national, 2 goals and all, we need to try to think not in terms of always it's a zero-sum trade-off. Are there possibility that there's complementary goals? Whether it is tudong, whether it is gay, lesbian issue, is it actually possible that it may not be a zero-sum trade-off? At least there can be a balance, or there actually can be integrative goals that we can still pursue two things together. Very difficult, but if we start having the mindset that it's always a trade-off, then it becomes problematic. Second, I also don't think that when you grant Group A something, you should only worry about Group B trying to get something. There's another dynamic going on. Once you grant Group A something, Group A will want another thing as well. So be very careful how Group A is prioritizing whatever Group A wants. Because if you allow Group A to have A, and then Group A comes with another request, which is actually, everybody agree, more fundamental than what you have just granted. It becomes quite impossible as a government not to grant based on just simple natural justice or rationality. So please understand, I'm not a politician, but please understand that when government react, it is actually much more than meets the eye, in my opinion, because it is not just a pushback issue. You know.
Okay, that's quite an elliptical remark, I think. I think we're running out of time, so I suggest we take all the questions, then I'll ask Anne and David to respond. I think we had some questions on this side of the hall. Yes? Yes, yes, it's on.
Hello, I'm
Kotai
Audrey Chin,
Oh,
and I'm
sorry.
an author, so I thank Minister of State for her promotion of Singapore literature. I want to ask a question for both of you, one in your capacity at the Ministry of Education, and the other one, of course, as an educator at one of our tertiary institutes. And the question is that if we believe there are all these new differences and old differences, for Minister of State, what can we do in terms of a program in our schooling system to make sure that we will actually have empathetic Singaporeans? And for Prof. Chan, I mean, in the same way, what is it that we are doing in tertiary education where you have many new potential PRs and citizens who actually very much remain in their own enclaves and are students? I mean, what can actually be done? This is the practice part of our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you very much. Yes, please.
I'm Kotai An from NTU Center for Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. Happens my academic discipline is literature, and happens also Minister of State, I'm in your constituency. But I'm in your constituency also, and I'm very heartened by your fervent support of literature. It's good to know that in the upper hierarchy of MOE we have a supporter. Now, my question is, what measures will the Ministry of Education be taking to increase the number of students in upper secondary taking literature for O and N levels? And this question is particularly crucial because you may or may not know that actually over the years it has been Ministry, MOE's policies, whether pragmatically or inadvertently, which have led to this drastic decline. It began in 1988 when from 100%, since previously everybody had to take literature, to 43% in 1988 when the whole school system was transformed, became, the English language became the sole medium of instruction. And language and literature were merged, with most schools choosing to focus on language necessarily. The next thing that happened, was the ranking in 1992, right? The MOE's decision to ranking, and many schools, including top schools, which had been very strong in literature, like Raffles Girls' School, dropped literature, was perceived to be a subject difficult to score well in, particularly among the top schools' distinctions. And thirdly, the other larger policy decisions have been the policy of bilingualism, which has taken up a lot of curriculum time at the expense of the humanities. There's only so much time on the curriculum, and something has to give way. And the creation, therefore, of this strange creature called combined humanities, which inadvertently, for various complex reasons, has been to the disadvantage of literature. So that the most recent figures, which are most startling, because the figures have been going down and down, in Parliament we hear that the percentage of students taking literature has gone down to 9%, which works out to only 3,000 students in actual figures. Now, I share with you, and we all share, the sense of the importance of literature in its capacity, right, to help children, acquire empathy, to acquire sensitivity, and also awareness on ambiguity, ambivalence, and the complexity of life in general. So it is not known as the queen of the humanities for nothing as a subject. But when we talk of literature in English, there is another complicating factor. We usually refer to the literature in English. Whereas actually there are also, as a result of the CIMO policy, right, literatures in the other languages too, which therefore split the attention of and the readership, of Singaporeans. And it means also that unlike other countries, we don't have a national literature. And we have therefore the anomaly of schools continuing to teach a literature that is British, right, because it's a colonial heritage. And the universities continue to call the subject English literature, although I notice the schools now call it literature in English. So what do we mean, therefore, when we talk about this subject literature,
thank you, Diane.
how do we therefore make it central again to the education of our young people? Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes? This side of the hall, anybody? Yes?
Hi. I just have a question. I guess one of the new differences that's been talked about is between citizens and PRs and foreigners, and there's been some conversation about xenophobia. I noticed that some of the earlier slides and the earlier speeches, and in general, there's a tendency to locate xenophobia online and in the form of inflammatory remarks online. I just wanted to ask about the role of state policy and societal structures in xenophobia, because, for example, foreign workers cannot organize in unions on the same basis as local workers. It's acceptable for bus drivers to be paid different wages based on their nationality. Domestic workers are not covered under the Employment Act. Given that there seems to be a societal structure which accepts that non-nationals can be treated as less than nationals in many of these key ways, should we really be surprised that xenophobia also emerges in the form of speech?
Thank you for your important question. Any other questions? Yes, please. A final question. Huh?
Thank you, Prof. Koh. I'm Chua Mui Hong. I'm with the Straits Times. I just wanted to get a panelist view on emerging, cleavages and so on. I noticed a lot of the discussion today focused on social cleavages, social value. I was just wondering to what extent what you guys think of the idea that there might be an emerging cleavage when it comes to political values. And I'm not just talking about different values in terms of identification with different political parties, but maybe more fundamentally, whether you see this as an emerging area of schism in terms of people's different views on democratic values, their views on civil liberties, rights, and even their views on the role of the state when it comes to allocating and redistributing resources. Okay. Just to get your views on that.
Thank you very much, Mayun. Okay, I think we'll stop there. Can each of you take not more than 3 minutes? Anne, please.
But then I won't be able to answer the question on literature, Prof.
You can do, all those of you who are interested in literature, please sit with Anne at lunch.
Okay. Very quick one on xenophobia. I just want to say that I think foreign workers do join unions. Quite a number of our unions do have non-Singaporean members. Now, in terms of, I think, overall attitudes towards different people who live and work in Singapore, I think overall the government has to uphold harmony. I think that's the most important. And with that, I think comes all of our various structures in ensuring that people are treated fairly. And xenophobia itself, I think, is a very fraught and very important topic. I want to actually tackle this together with empathy, which was the question that Audrey also raised. I would say that by and large, because I am very conscious that all questions ultimately boil down to education. So I want to say that this is certainly one area in which the ministry is very conscious of the responsibility to foster in our next generation, I think, healthy attitudes as well as effective skills to deal with essentially what is an unknowable future. And what this means is we have put in place a focus on holistic education, on values-based education, on the competencies that we term 21st century competencies, essentially through various programs, exposing students to different types of situation, bringing them out into the community. And I think over time, a lot of these programs will continue to evolve and I hope become even more effective. So this is something that I would certainly be very happy to hear ideas from members of the audience, especially over lunch later on. A quick reply to Mui Hong's question, certainly, I would say that political values are every bit as relevant as and as important a differentiator as anything else. This is certainly something that is very much worth watching.
David?
Okay, I cannot answer all the questions because it's only 3 minutes. So I am just going to say that for tertiary education or anywhere for that matter, it is important to decompose the problem about too many or different nationalities. Is it a matter of crowding, just physical number of people of discomfort, or is it an issue of clustering, that at certain places there are just too many people clustering, and so I'm not going to go there and feel them feel uncomfortable, and I feel uncomfortable, and there's a big, huge effect there? Or is it a situation of competition, that because we are competing for resources, for the same grades and so on? Or is it an issue of overt conflict, right? So you have all the various C's there, right? Whether it is crowding, clustering, or is it, and so on. And then you address it with other C's, which I've written before, so I'm not going to go in detail, right? You address it from conflict resolution, communication, being citizen-centric, and have community development, and so on. So it's a tough thing, but I think there are quite a bit of stuff written on there, so I'm not going to focus on the tertiary alone. But I do want to just finish the point on tertiary to say, please pay attention to them. It's not only the students, it's also the faculty, and the faculty, meaning the professors, are huge role models, both bad and good, and also the professors have a huge influence on the thoughts of the students. And this is the time where they develop not only their core values, but their thought values in order to come out and say, I want to make a difference to Singapore, how am I going to do it? So the undergraduate education part is extremely important. And I think we need to make sure that there is a good balance of faculty within university for that particular purpose, right? And I will just finish up with the point on political values that Mui Hun talked about. I actually of the opinion that political values are not, academically speaking, they are not fundamental. They are second order. That means that they are actually rooted in a more fundamental value such as individualism versus collectivism, or values such as social order, and values such as freedoms and so on. So then when you bring all these values, composite them together, and you move slightly upwards, then you can talk about values about education, values about political systems. And in the same way that meritocracy, I think, is actually a second order value. So what values that we have been talking about actually I think is entirely relevant. And I think it is important to move away from political values because they are too close to ideologies and political parties. Bring it down to values about principles about the human being and so on. Then we can have a discourse. Because if you have political ideologies, you actually are shortchanging yourself because no one party or ideology is all perfect. There will be lots of problems within each one. But if you go down to values, you can actually have a functioning society where we can give and take and so on.
So what's your short answer to Mui Hun's question? Is there a new cleavage in our political values? Say yes or no.
Academics is manifested from social values, I think.
Mui Hun, you have to ask him to write 800 words with you.
We have that problem, isn't it?
I'm going to ask Lynn to come back on stage and conduct her poll. Professor, I never give you a straight
Thank you, Prof. Koh, Minister Sim Ann and Prof. Chan for your views, and to members of the audience for your questions. Ladies and gentlemen, before we break for lunch, we will have a second poll. The question is now being flashed on the screens, and it reads, what is the best way to deal with problems that arise from our differences? Please key in the number that corresponds with your choice of answer now.
Yeah, that's right. Everybody can.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. The results are now up on the screen, and we can see that many
Wow,
of
more
you
community.
feel that the best
Wow,
way to
overwhelming
deal
result.
with problems arising from our differences is through more community involvement in decision making.